Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pels.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
You're nodding your head furiously, Tom. Talk to us. What's going on in your mind here?
Because the premise here is homeostasis, and the human mind can very much either support that or contravene it. And so the premise here is the brain doing the thinking and letting it be in charge, connecting that with the interoceptive awareness and that type of cognition with our mind, but it's not us in charge. It's the brain itself in charge, and the brain has a wisdom that the human mind just simply doesn't possess, and does things then in ways that the human mind thinks are either pathological or thinks are healing, but it might be completely different. It reminded me, Scott, when you were talking about this notion of, well, this is how the termite mound functions. And then you are dealing with a termite mound and going, no, it doesn't. It doesn't function that way at all. And when you injected those gases into the termite mound, you're going, I'm not seeing what was supposed to happen. I'm seeing something entirely different. And then your deeper and deeper exploration of the respiration of the termite mound, which wasn't the respiration that everybody thought and said, well, this is how it must function. And the termite mound is going, no, I don't. I don't function that way at all.
Well, I'm going to put on my physiologist hat here. And, the idea of, well, we're trained to think of the body as this separate group of separate systems, and if you look at medical school textbooks of physiology, I taught nursing students for a while and taught physiology to nursing students. And they all are built around something I call the anatomical fallacy. And the anatomical fallacy is that the body is this kind of cobbled together bunch of systems that act more or less autonomously. And so you have a digestive system, and you have a respiratory system, and you have a cardiovascular system, and those are treated separately in most textbooks. But when it comes to the function of the body, you can't actually do that. It's the explanatory power of this kind of anatomizing the body into separate systems is very limited, and it doesn't allow you to explain some fundamental things about the way that the body works. And so the favorite example that I would use is the lung. The lung is a respiratory system. It's built to exchange gases between the atmosphere and the blood. Okay, fair enough. But the lung is also a very powerful endocrine organ. It secretes endocrine hormones. And so is it part of the endocrine system, or is it part of the respiratory system, or is it somehow both? And this is leading up to this notion of, the anatomical fallacy extends, I think, to the architecture of the nervous system. And so, you have the brain, that's a seat of consciousness, as far as we know, although it extends probably further. In physiology and anatomy textbooks, you have the central nervous system, you have all little bits of it, you have the peripheral nervous system, you have the autonomic nervous system, you have all these kind of separate things. And I'm not sure you can separate it all that much, So, for example, you have an incredible array of nerve endings in your skin, for example, that feeds into the brain. We become consciously aware of it, but those kinds of flows of information are going to ramify into all kinds of other sorts of things. It will change the heart rate. It will change the cardiovascular tone, all those other kinds of things. Similar kind of thing happens within the brain, for example. we can point to particular regions of the brain that supposedly do certain things, but then you get into all kinds of blurry boundaries between them, and it gets hard to separate one from the other. And so, as I understand the autonomic healing system, Tom, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, is that you have a response to stress. Okay, the perception of that stress happens in the brain, or at least a conscious awareness of it. This elicits certain changes in autonomic tone between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And what's going on in things like post-traumatic stress syndrome, all kinds of other things like that, is that the body is dysregulating its normal functions. And so your approach is to make people aware of what's going on, what's being mediated by the autonomic nervous system, so they can maybe consciously change behaviors that do that. Now, I would come at this as from the many little lives homeostasis perspective. So for example, if a person experiences a stressful event, all right, there's sensory inputs of this, not only comes in through our conscious senses, but also is sensed by the body. We're not really consciously aware of these kinds of things, and this feeds back into the brain to be processed by the subcortical nuclei and the limbic system and the I think it's the medullary nuclei as well. And this comes and influences autonomic tone, and this changes things like heart rate, peripheral blood flow, all the kinds of fight or flight kinds of things versus what I used to call the couch potato syndrome, which is you're content, you're not really looking to go anywhere. Now, so far, that's something that I think you and I would be on very much the same page. But when this happens persistently, you're not only responding, but you're also restructuring not only the systems there, but you're structuring the neural pathways, because the neural pathways are dynamic, just like the termite mound is. Depending upon the information flowing through them, the pattern of connections can change. And so if you have repeated stress, and now I'm just pulling this out of my head right now because you're the expert here, not me. If you have repeated stress going on, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be restructuring the entire body. There's no way of separating the brain from the rest of it. And as you know, there are lots of systems within the body, like the digestive system, that contain their own nervous systems that interact with the regular nervous system. And if that's restructured, that's going to be a different state around which the body is geared to regulating. In other words, you have homeostasis. Well, like I said, these kinds of pathological state, PTSD, other kinds of things, we tend to call it, something like learned helplessness or learned behavior or something like that. But it's homeostasis as much as the other is. And in the case of someone who's suffering from one of these pathologies, that body is being regulated just as strongly as it is for someone who's not suffering from those problems. And the trick is how to get the regulated state from one back to a healthy state. That, to me, is the essence of what you're talking about.
And it is, yes. It's the cognition of the brain and our interoceptive awareness of it doing the restructuring now on its terms, rather than having to accommodate us with our minds and the ecosystem we live in, rather than having to have it accommodate that and do its cognition, its homeostatic cognition that way. It's the brain itself on its terms, uninterrupted. It's like the aardvark has attacked the termite colony and just letting the termite colony restore that function and that ecosystem that is within us. And that is what AHA does. It lets the natural process of homeostasis simply work. And it does the thinking. We're simply aware of the brain thinking that.
Yeah. I would say that to take the analogy, I would say that it's kind of like the aardvark continually attacking a termite mound, and so you get a modification of the entire termite mound that's different from what you would get with, say, an aardvark coming along every 6 months and digging a hole in the mound. That, as I understand your approach, is really what's going on there. And I would just add, you don't really need to be aware of it, because it happens, because you have all, you have this incredible communication system within the body. They all interact. They all talk to one another. They all negotiate in the many little lives, a metaphor to some kind of mutual accommodation. And the mutual accommodation comes out as some kind of pathological state that sort of bubbles up into the consciousness and our conscious awareness. And this, of course, is one of the big differences between cognition and consciousness. You don't have to be aware of cognition. Little bacterium is a cognitive system, but it would be a bridge way too far for me to say that the bacterium is a conscious system.
Yes. So it's, from a mental health perspective, we are our own aardvarks. Attacking our own termite mounds. Right. And the termite mound itself of our body is going, seriously? Would you just please stop? No, I'm so smart and I've figured so much out. And if I just do this, then it'll be better. And the cognition of the brain and the body's going, no, it won't.
Yeah, that's this kind of persistent attack of the aardvark, as you will, or your internal aardvark, for example, I think is what leads you to some these kinds of pathological states that you deal with so often.
I love that what we just talked about, because it's what you're basically saying is that we're all in homeostasis. Our body is doing that regardless of whether we've changed. So the consequence of stress and trauma then is just the constant stress and trauma. Possibly is more that it's just like reforming in a less beneficial way. And so I think what we're talking about is autonomic healing potentially is allowing us to bring homeostasis back into, what would you say, Tom, that normal state that we were created? Or
this is the odd thing here. It's all homeostasis. It's a question of where the organization of that homeostatic system is. And Aristotle, this is going way back, Aristotle actually explained it this way. If you look at an organism, right, it's a manifestation of something that he called the bios. And this was, so a quail has a quail bios, for example. And that's what the quail, the organism, is supposed to be. And everything about the quail that you see is not the bios; it's the expression of the bios. And that's been translated into the kind of modern concept of homeostasis, because homeostasis, at least as it was formulated in the 19th century by Claude Bernard and other pioneers there, it treats the organism as the expression of basically homeostasis. And all kinds of things feed into that, and there's incredible complicated communication systems, responses, all those kind of things. It's all cognitive, and it's always homeostatic, because as long as the organism persists, there's homeostasis going on there. The only time you actually lose homeostasis is when you start to sicken and die. That's the failure of homeostasis. So So the question is not, do you restore homeostasis per se? It's always homeostatic, but what homeostatic state do you restore it to? And
Yes.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And the premise and what I've observed is that when the brain itself is in charge of that, it gets to a much more optimal degree of fitness.
well, that could be,
That would be what I would describe, and that's what people describe when they go into the session. Like I did a session yesterday with someone. They went into the session with post-traumatic stress disorder and all the definitions and symptomology of that, and at the end had none. And we're not aware of any of that symptomology. No sense of stress, anxiety, depression, or anger. And it's the degree of how optimal the brain can get us to, and then how much we will resist the urge to play the role of the aardvark with our own termite mound.
We are consciously aware of being able to do things. If you look at the way the brain is organized, for example, the cortex, which as far as we know is where the conscious perception of the environment comes in. The cortex has some very powerful influences on the subcortical nuclei and then all the way down. So you can use our fairly highly developed conscious awareness of things to influence physiology, and it doesn't have to be there. You can have a fight or flight response without really much conscious awareness of what's going on. But what you can do is you can use conscious awareness of whatever's going on to actually tamp that down. And I think that's probably what's going on with your patients. People come in, their body is sort of on autopilot, if you will, organizing itself around this abnormal homeostatic state, still homeostatic. And as you described it to me, you try to make people consciously aware of what's going on in their bodies, what's happening with things that are regulated by the autonomic nervous system, things like gut tension, blood pressure, heart rate, blood oxygenation, all those kinds of things. And once people are aware of a different way of thinking about it, then they can actually start to retrain their autonomic nervous system back to a normal state. I think by making them consciously aware of what's going on inside their bodies, which most people really aren't, by making them consciously aware of that, then you open up the ways for the cortical system, the conscious awareness, to come in and modify that. And I may have it wrong. I'm not sure. You showed me some statistics about how people's various measures of anxiety and those kinds of things change as a result of one session. I don't know the extent to which people relapse or the kind of struggles that they go through on their own to, if they experience anxious states, but then they know how to tamp it down, those kinds of things. But, I think the general approach, which is to help your many little lives basically remodel the way information flows and matter flows and all these kinds of things within the body, can have a very beneficial effect, because these pathological states, they're trained states. People who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, they come to that either through persistent levels of high stress, such as in warfare or things like this, or a really disruptive single incident, and that's started the whole body on the pathway to being reshaped to where this is kind of a permanent state. And the trick to me is training the homeostatic state back to a different, still homeostatic state. That seems to me what's the essence of what you're talking about.
And it's the instrumentality of the cognition of interoception
that
allows it to simply be a sensory experience.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah. I mean, there are sensors all through the body. You can access them somehow. But the amount of information flow throughout the body, nervous system, everything. That's something that is often not appreciated. Especially in this
yep.
anatomizing
Mhm.
mode of thinking of the human body.
Have we talked, Tom, much about, I'm sure you described to Scott about what happens in a session and the involuntary movements that happen? Scott, I've been through it, I've been through a session, many sessions actually, but that first session, the way I would describe it is there's this swinging of almost, it is homeostatic activity in all ways, but one is kind of swinging from what I would describe as kind of fight and flight to, is it the parasympathetic, over a course of, a number of hours.
Yeah.
So I'm just really curious. I mean, I was like, what the heck is happening? What is happening here? And I think, I mean, we joke all the time. It's like that so many clients are like, this is
Weird.
so weird.
Yes.
And maybe there isn't like an explanation for it, but there's tingling, there's twitching, and then there's this kind of sense of calm and rest, and then it goes up again, and then that was my experience anyhow. So I'm curious if you've had any conversation around that or any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, anytime you have a homeostatic system, and I'm going to draw an analogy from the cybernetic approach to homeostasis now. As I said, even though it doesn't explain very much, it does explain some of it. And so imagine that you have your body regulating around PTSD homeostasis point, right? If you're becoming aware of these sensations, what you're trying to what's happening there is you pushing that system away from that abnormal homeostatic state. When you do that, the body tries to get back to that. And there's a phenomenon in all these kinds of cybernetic systems called hunting. And so if you change the thermostat, for example, in your house, the temperature will change gradually, and it'll get up to the new point, and then it'll oscillate back and forth around that slightly. And if you have a badly tuned homeostatic system, that phenomenon, which is called hunting, can be quite severe or quite strong. And so when you describe the swaying back and forth here, that reminds me very much of this phenomenon of hunting, which is common to cybernetic homeostatic systems, and so again, that to me is perfectly consistent with this notion of you're trying to manipulate homeostasis through altering the feedbacks, or if you will, and conscious perception of these things is obviously a very important part of it. But this kind of swaying behavior that you're talking about, or little tics that start to come in, there are all kinds of different ways that the response to this kind of push your body away from a particular homeostatic state can start to come in.
Interesting. Tom, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's just fascinating because it's the involuntary activity that the brain generates in the body is so often just beneficially unusual and unexpected and unanticipated, and from other paradigms would be viewed as something is going wrong, and yet it's the way the brain is restoring toward optimal. This is the most I had a quote from you.
Is this in Purpose and Desire?
No, this is from a monograph, Many Little Lives. Okay, I think it is. The extended homeostasis of the termite colony has set and driven their fitness milieu. Their evolution has has been dominated by physiological rather than genetic factors. It is a common phenomenon in nature. Life inexorably modifies the environment in which it is embedded. And I think that's what's being observed, is that life and that modification for fitness is what is occurring, because the brain itself and this principle of homeostasis, this dynamic of homeostasis, gets to be ascendant over the other factors. And so it strives for the greatest fitness.
Yeah, and it strives for persistence, I would say.
Yep.
I think in evolutionary biology, for one thing, we don't really have a very good concept of what fitness is. It's defined in various ways, but there are lots of different ways of doing it. But in the Darwinian sense, and I'm talking about Charles Darwin's Darwinism rather than the Darwinism we have today.
Yes.
In Charles Darwin's mind, what made an organism fit or not was how well adapted it was to its environment, and the problem with the whole Darwinian idea and Charles Darwin's own Darwinian idea is that it doesn't account for organisms changing their environment to adapt the environment to themselves, and so that's what I mean by the organism controlling its adaptive milieu. There are lots of aspects of the environment that feed into the persistence of an organism. Ultimately, it boils down to maintaining the flows of matter and energy that an organism needs to persist. That's where the homeostasis, or where the connection between homeostasis and adaptation come in, and that's all physiological. And now there are the modern Darwinian idea looks at mechanism or adaptability as the outcome of selection for adaptive function genes, and there's a whole set of assumptions that goes into that. One is that the gene basically is an inviolable component of determination of the organism, and so if you have a well-adapted organism, it's because that organism contains genes that specify good adaptation, and the only way you can get a change is by changing those genes. But in fact, as we understand more and more about the way genes work, we're finding out that actually you get a lot of feedback and actually definition of genes from physiology itself. And so, this is a phenomenon called epigenetics. And for a long time, it was thought that these kinds of modifications of genes during the lifetime of an organism could not be transmitted from one generation to another. But now we're finding out that's not true, that you actually get feedback of adaptation onto genes, and you can actually define the expression of a gene kind of on the fly, if you will. But I'd like to come back to something that you said, Ruth. You mentioned that you had experienced this, and during the session, you kind of experienced this sort of what I'm calling a hunting behavior.
I like that. I like the phrase, the hunting behavior. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How long did that last? I mean, was it over after the session was done, or did you experience it for some time after the session?
Yeah, I think I would say what happened during the session was this kind of hunting, and as it seemed to, as it went further down the road, the time between the two, it was less frequent. So it was just kind of more time in there, and then so it kept going towards the parasympathetic. And then afterwards, I think I remember telling Tom, and I think this is a frequent thing, I had like the best sleep of my life. I've got young children, so I'm like, okay, I had the best sleep of my life. And then I think there was a good couple of weeks, I would say, of just feeling like, oh, this is different. I had a lot of stress and trauma, a lot of anxiety in my body. I had like a lot of fibromyalgia symptoms. that suddenly went. So I don't know what that was. And then what Tom does is that he teaches you the practice of, you know, I remember you saying, Tom, it's like you brush your teeth, you know, you do it before bed, you know, in the morning, at night. So there's this practice of autonomic healing and doing it myself. Seems to be I've seemed to be able to like you say, reposition homeostasis back into that more optimal space. So that's my experience. But yeah, it's not, you know, it's not like a magic pearl. It's not, it's not going to be like that. But I think that from dealing with stress and trauma for such a long time and not having breakthrough, you know, and doing all of multiple different things like meditation and yoga and walking, I mean, you know, all of the practices, it was a dramatic difference that first session, and then obviously needs to be maintained. But so that was my understanding of it in my own life. You know, you say, Tom, don't you, it doesn't, like, it works for like, what's your percentage you give it, like 80 or 90% of people? Because there are a few that just don't cooperate with it.
Oh, it's like 1 or 2 out of 100 it does not work for, because they won't resist the urge to interfere in the involuntary activity. If it itches, they'll scratch the itch. If it wants to involuntarily move a part of the body, they'll resist that. Or when it's doing involuntary activity that they find uncomfortable, or they have formed a belief about because it's been told to them that if, for instance, there's pain, then that means something is going wrong. But pain is a way that the brain can signal the body to create new cells. Obviously something very important in healing, but we don't like pain, and so we pathologize pain. So when the brain is doing that, it's like feeding in from their mind stress into the system, which is triggering the flight or fight response. And so the sympathetic is working contrary to the parasympathetic, and the parasympathetic is going, I would help if I could, but the mind won't let me, because it refuses to simply accept this is healing, however it feels. And it's a natural function that the brain is engaging in toward normalizing and optimizing the system. And so for 1 or 2 out of 100, no, it doesn't work, and it won't work because it can't.
And a few of the times as well, this has just popped into my head, but there's been a couple of times where, like, I remember the first time I went through my major session, I just felt like really kind of like I could sleep well. I could never sleep well. So I slept right the way through the night. I was able just to relax and sleep. So that was a big deal for me. And then, but I've also felt like a little high, like just like, woo, like, you know, like a little buzzy, and then also felt really hungry. Like, oh my gosh, I could like eat and just, but this kind of, but not in a bad way, but in a sense of, I feel like I can, there's just like, I can be me, you know, and like just eat. And so I don't know, like I've talked to you about that sometimes, Tom, I'm like, what is that, you know? But those are just a few little observations.
Yeah. So it sounds from your description, Ruth, that, and this is probably a trivial way of expressing it, but once in the session where you learn to fiddle the knobs, there was an extended period of basically recalibration of everything. So that's consistent with this notion that you're in one homeostatic state, and and the healing is coming from trying to retrain your body to another one that's more pleasant. And of course, you know, I have to bring in here that the importance of the pleasure reward system. You know, we continue to do things that give us pleasure and satisfaction. And so if you suddenly discover that you're able to actually control this, that's a reward. And again, that's consistent with the whole recalibration thing. You know, you have lots of pathologies of the pleasure reward system, as we know, ranging from self-inflicted, like addiction, to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, those kinds of things. You know, those are all tied into the pleasure reward system of the brain, and I'm sure that's playing a pretty significant role in the therapy and the success of the therapy that you're talking about.
So if I may go into one more thing, and we've got Ruth here. So one of the things that you have talked about and we chatted about the other day was creativity and the connection to homeostasis of creativity. And one of the things that Ruth can talk about is the shift that's occurred through her. And all other things being considered, I think the primary factor has been AHA in terms of this explosion of creativity that's occurring in your life.
Yeah, you'll put me on the spot, Tom, but
I will.
yeah,
Because it's brilliant.
Well, it is interesting, like I've been in this space for a number of years now, but what I found is I think there's just a freedom to be more fully like me. So one of the things, I'm quite a creative person anyhow, and I'm a communicator and strategy and vision and coming up with ideas all left, right, and center. But one of the things that I just started doing just about 8 months ago is this what you want me to talk about? It's just like I just started writing poetry. Now I'm 47, so I have never written poetry at all. And it just came out of, and I think you have like ideas of, oh, well, they're the artists and I'm not that, and we have these constructs of who we are and who we're not. And so I think there's just been this space through, I guess, not having so much anxiety probably and stress and being able to be in that more optimal space has allowed me to realize that oh yeah, that's part of me. And so I just started, like one day I just thought I'm going to write a poem, and then I started writing, and I've got a bit of a collection going now, and maybe pull a book out at the end of this year or something. But so it's been really interesting to see the development of another. It's like almost I feel like this was always there in me, but it never had chance to have an expression because I was so locked up in whatever stress and trauma. It was like my brain wasn't able to expand fully because of my circumstances. So I don't know what you think about all of that.
The whole issue of cognition and intentionality doesn't really, our reductionist ways of thinking about cognition, namely you have information in the environment that's encoded into something and that produces a cognitive map. That's very one way, but it doesn't look into the other aspect of it so much, which is it also goes back the other way. You can have cognitive systems structuring environments, right? Normally we think that, you see a red light and that sets off a certain stimulus chain and the retina and geniculate nuclei and occipital cortex and all that. And then if the light changes to green, that sets off another pathway. And so our visual cognitive system tracks what's happening outside very closely. And when you start looking at the other dimension of it, which is the feedback of that system onto the environment, all right, there's a kind of homeostasis there as well, and this is where you start getting into intentionality. And so, for example, if you perceive something about the environment that doesn't match what your brain, or your conscious brain, is saying should be there, you can get busy and modify your external environment so that the environment comes into conformity with your with the cognitive map in your brain. And this is where these kinds of feedback therapies can start to be explained. The problem there is that that's the simplest definition of intentionality. You have a cognitive vision, that's in scare quotes there, a cognitive vision, and you get to work bringing the world into conformity with your cognitive vision. So you're intending to actually modify the environment in a particular way, back to where your brain thinks it should be. Then when you talk about creativity, there's no reason to think that that your cognitive vision is connected in any way to your sensory system. But if you can still modify the external environment to make that cognitive vision become real, that's creativity. Now, how that fits into the burst of creativity that you're describing after a therapy session, I don't know. It may be that the whole cognitive homeostatic system is so geared to one particular thing, namely maintaining that pathological state, PTSD or what have you. But if you can remove that, then this means that cognitive maps that don't have anything to do with the ongoing maintenance of this abnormal state, you can now create entire new worlds of that. So that may be the explanation of creativity. But as I said, neuroscience is actually very reluctant to get into concepts like intentionality and creativity, which is a big problem in neuroscience these days. And I think it's because they're not thinking about it correctly.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So bottom line, this is about being alive and what makes something alive and how can we participate in that process of being alive and not try to shape it, determine it ourselves, but connect with a deeper wisdom that is our life and existence itself, and let that inform us.
Yeah, I think life is one of those. I mean, it's a cliche to say that it's a wonderful mystery, right? But in fact, life is not just the material world. It's not just atoms flowing this way or the other, or can't be explained fully by laws of thermodynamics. There is something very distinctive about life. That's the subtitle in Purpose and Desire, and that's why it was put in quotes. We're not really comfortable with the notion that life is somehow a distinct phenomenon. And of course, what makes life distinctive is that it's cognitive, it's intentional, and it's purposeful. And then the cloves of garlic go up. You're saying things that are not that don't sit comfortably in our modern scientific way of thinking. And I'm a scientist. So.
Scott, we're so grateful to have you on here, and it is a huge gift to us. So thank you. And tell us a little bit before, as we're closing, what's coming up for you? Got any books on the horizon, or you're doing bits and pieces? Anything you want to share at all here?
Well, I'm retired now, which was a liberating experience for me, I have to say. One of the things that happened in my career is that I became increasingly dismayed by the way our higher education system is going. I think that it's getting further and further away from its original conception, which is to have a safe place for radical ideas to be tossed around openly and in a collegial way, and that's one of the reasons why I left academia, actually, by the way, why I retired. And so I'm working with a group called the National Association of Scholars that's dedicated to try to bring the university back to its core mission, which is transmission and generation of knowledge, no matter where it goes.
And that's one of the things that we've just really appreciated. Obviously, this is, a bit radical autonomic healing, and, so being able to kind of toss it around in this space with you and your background has been wonderful and just a huge blessing. So thank you so much. And hopefully we're going to try and have you back on at some point in a year or so. I don't know.
That's assuming that this has been positive and you're willing.
No, I'd always be willing. I'm really interested to see how it's received by your listeners. I'm looking forward to sharing whatever comes out of it with my little circle.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a wrap, right, Tom?
Yep. Wonderful. Thank you, Scott.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.